Right, good morning, welcome back. Now, whilst I'm waiting for some parts on the project, we have time to fit in something a little bit different. Now, we've made a note of 5 recurring complaints, and we thought in a light-hearted way we would address them. Okay, number 1, and probably the most common, what's with the black gloves? Now, it's not when I'm handling the poisonous fluids connected with vehicles, the oils, the brake fluid, the coolant, all that sort of thing. I don't get the question then. I get the question, what's with the rubber gloves, when I'm handling clean things and it's not apparent that I would need them. Now, unless you make video yourself and you take a pride in your editing, then it's probably not something you've come across. And it's actually easier to show you rather than tell you. So I've got a black cloth laid out and I'll demonstrate exactly why I wear black gloves. So if I'm demonstrating something on the bench with a glove on, nice and clear, all nice and visible. But if I bring a naked hand in, straight away, look what happens. The skin tone alters the metering on the camera and it darkens the whole scene. And you can't see the parts clearly, it's all dingy. Take the hand away, bring in a black gloved hand, and it doesn't affect it at all. Skin tone, glove. Skin tone, glove. Right, so as you can see, it's all about light metering in the camera. And it doesn't matter what you spend on your camera equipment, you will always have to compensate for it one way or another. And I choose the simplest and easiest way of all to compensate for it. Just wear similar colour gloves to the background you're working on. Right, number 2, why don't you give torque settings in your videos? Well, I certainly used to, but there's a couple of reasons why I don't do it anymore. I still show the process of torquing things up, but I took the values off the screen. I don't bother anymore because people tend to skip forward and they miss them anyway, and then they're asking you what they were. But there's a second and far more critical reason why I don't think it's sensible to put exact torque values on the screen. And that is, you could be watching a given video for a generic guidance on a job. This is an 03 XJR, yours might be an 06. And I'm sure you'll understand that it's possible the torque settings could be different between 03 and 06. So I think rather than me put the torque values on the screen, because that only applies to my particular year, you look them up for yourself on your particular year, then you know you'll get them right. Number 3, it's not really a complaint at us. It's more a general grumble, but it is quite common. And that is, what size is that flipping great nut on my rear axle? Now, generally in motorcycle work, there aren't many fasteners much bigger than 19mm. Most of them are around that size or less, except for the wheel axles. They're always up in the 30s. On this one, the XJR, that wheel axle nut is 32. On a Hayabusa, it's 36. Whacking great big thing. Now, we haven't got a socket for that in a general, ordinary, generic socket set. So there's 2 options to get around that. Well, option 1 is go buy yourself a socket set like this, 3/4 drive from 20 to 46mm with all the pertinent sizes in between, job done. But that's a lot of money, up to 150, 200 pounds for a socket set like this of any quality. Or option 2, a lot more favourable, buy just the one socket you need. And finding the exact socket you need, therein lies the grumble. What size is that whacking great nut, please, Del? Well, here's 3 ways you can find out. Right, the first way, and it's a bit of a dodge, is to look it up for sale. You might not have thought of that. Go online, look up Yamaha XJR 1300, whatever your bike is, rear wheel nut. And when you see all the listings come up, you'll see the size listed. And it will say XJR 1300 rear wheel nut, 32mm. And that's your size. You found out the information. Or a simpler way, to be honest, is just to measure it. And there's 2 ways to do that. First way is take your caliper and close the jaws across the flats of the nut. And there we are. It will measure just under the socket size. That measures 31.6mm. It will always be a fraction less, so the socket goes over it. So 31.6, that's a 32mm socket, size found. If you haven't got one of these, there's a little hack you can use to measure those flats. I'll show you. All right, grab yourself your smooth jaw pliers. If you haven't bought yourself a set of these yet, I'll leave a link in the description and I'll show you how we use them. All right, open up the pliers as far as they'll go, and then click them down onto 2 flats of the nut, like that. And with it held on the nut, just measure the gap. It's as simple as that. There we are. Just over 31mm. Job done. So there it is, the simplest way. Rather than getting frustrated with it, just measure. the nut itself by whatever means necessary, and then you can just buy the one socket, nice economical solution. Now for the fourth one, it's a bit of a grumble about why do you continually throw your chuck key into its bracket? We know, it's an old trick. Don't keep doing it, it's boring. I get that, but I've got to say, I don't do it for you, I don't do it for entertainment, I do it for me. It's a very important critical safety thing, and for those who don't know, I'll explain briefly why. Now, I don't mean it's important to film it, I mean it's important to do it, to make sure that your chuck key is in a safe place before you press the start button. Now, if you're filming and you're handling parts and moving around, you're moving the camera, you're moving the lighting, I'm doing a lot more when I'm making a lathe video than just the machining. Lots of other considerations that are distracting. And obviously, I'm sure it's clear, if you take your chuck key and it's in your chuck, and you forget that it's in the chuck or you leave it in the chuck and then you hit the start button, this big old chunk of metal becomes quite dangerous. It goes flying, it gets thrown out of the chuck, and it'll either go over your shoulder and damage the wall behind you, or if you're unlucky, it's going to collect you. So seriously, the only way to make sure you don't make that fatal, classic machining error of leaving the chuck key in the chuck before you start the machine is to make sure that it's in its place. I created that bracket so that my chuck key has its own little home. It lives there. And every time I hit my start button, I pause for a second and I glance at that bracket. And if for some reason that's not in there, stop. It might not be in the chuck. I might have put it there, or I might have, the worst one, put it on top of the machine. Now it's not in the chuck, but if I then start the machine up, that can still vibrate and then collect the spinning chuck, which also sends it ballistic. So this big chunky piece of metal is only safe to start the machine when it's in its bracket. And that's why not only do I do it every time, but I film it, because if I film it, I know I'm taking and paying attention to it, and I'm never going to get it wrong. That's the reason why. Right, the fifth and final complaint is number plates. Why, when you put a bike on the lift, do you always take the number plates off? Well, there are two reasons for that. One that's quite obvious, and one maybe not so obvious. Well, the first reasons I think are obvious. It's privacy and security. Naturally, the number identifies the motorcycle. There's a copious amount of information out there on the back of that number if you go to look it up on government websites, and people can start fishing around and finding out all about your bike and everything else. Now, it doesn't matter to me. I've got nothing to hide. I don't really care. And most people are the same. But for the people who bring bikes to me to be worked on, anybody's bike who is not mine, I prefer to protect their security and their privacy, and I just take the plate off. So no one can tell whose bike it is and no one can identify anything about it. And that's the simple reason. But the second reason is a little bit more related to the gloves issue. Yes, it's related to filming. Look at this scene for just a minute. Look at this shot that I'm taking. Now watch. If I take that away, look how it changes. Put it back, and straight away it dominates the entire scene. It's the first thing you look at. It's visually distracting. It's bright yellow. That's why we paint roadside workers in bright yellow and orange, so you can see them and don't drive into them. That's why the hand poles and grab rails on public transport are always bright yellow, because you can see them. And number plates are that colour, so you can obviously see them. And also, numbers and letters, they're visually distracting. Your brain naturally reads numbers and letters. You don't have to try. But if you take it away, there's nothing distracting. That's the reason I do it. Look at that scene and that shot now. Look at it now. I'm sure you'll agree that is far more distracting and obvious than that. So I take my plates off purely because when I'm filming, I think it gives a better shot for you to enjoy. That's why. Well, there we are, all in good humour. A few grumbles answered while we're waiting for some parts for the project. And we've got to say a heartfelt thank you to all of you for your wonderful, kind and generous support. We couldn't make the channel happen without you, especially our patrons that help us to keep everything going. And just to show you that it doesn't always go according to plan, we'll leave you with these. Take it easy, ride safe. See you next time.